What's up guys, my name is Ace, and today we're going to be talking about the Scope Glint in Modern Warfare. This is something, especially since Warzone launched, I've had a ton of people asking about various elements of this and how it works exactly. So in today's relatively quick video, I wanted to break it down and share with you exactly how the Scope Glint works, as well as answer some common questions about Scope Glint. So for those of you guys that live under a rock, when you aim down sights in Modern Warfare with a high zoom optic, which I'll talk about the details of that in a little bit, you will have a very bright glint that shows up for enemy players in front of your face, and this is designed to keep the sniper rifles balanced, especially within Warzone. Otherwise, you'd just be getting picked off by people that you never see constantly in that game, and it would make sniper rifles completely overpowered. I'm sure most of you guys already are well aware of that and have possibly had some nightmares surrounding the Scope Glint, but let's get into how it works. The first thing I want to cover is which optics will show Scope Glint and which ones won't. With this, the general rule of thumb, keeping in mind it is possible there are some exceptions out there for guns that have unique optics, but the general rule of thumb is if the optic has more than a 4x zoom, the enemy will be able to see Scope Glint when you're aiming down sight in their direction. So all of the default sniper scopes, if you use a sniper rifle without changing any of your optics out, they have Scope Glint. If you use a sniper scope, for instance, on an assault rifle, that will have Scope Glint when aiming down sight in the direction of your enemy. Whereas if you're using a lower zoom optic, even on a sniper rifle, something like a VLK 3x scope, for instance, you will not have any Scope Glint. Now, if you want to confirm this, you can actually see this within the gunsmith itself when you are selecting an optic. The optics that will have Scope Glint, they actually have some red text on them that will let you know that enemies will see that Scope Glint if you're aiming in their direction. Now, there were a few exceptions to this and some bugs in the past where they didn't label this properly, but to my knowledge, all of that has been worked out and the descriptions on these are actually accurate now. Somebody can let me know, though, if there is still an exception to that. One thing I did want to mention, though, that is a common question for those that understand that 4x threshold is what if you have a hybrid optic where the low zoom setting is below that 4x threshold, whereas the high zoom setting is above that 4x threshold? Do you only get Scope Glint when aiming down sight with the high zoom setting, or does it work with the low zoom setting as well? I put this one to the test, and it turns out with these optics, even on the low zoom setting, you will have Scope Glint and the enemies will be able to see that. So it's definitely a big trade-off you have to be aware of when choosing one of those hybrid sights. Now, as far as what it takes to actually see this Scope Glint in-game, you aren't going to be seeing Scope Glint from an enemy player if they aren't looking in your direction. And I actually managed to find out the exact cone of this Scope Glint. And what I found using the compass at the top of the screen is if you're 10 degrees or less off target, they can still see your Scope Glint, but anything more than 10 degrees off center, they will no longer see that Scope Glint from you. So overall, adding up both sides, you get a 20-degree cone that you're projecting outwards where enemies are able to see your Scope Glint if they're within that cone. So this is quite important if you are on the receiving end of this. If you see Scope Glint, especially at like somewhat closer to mid-range, they are absolutely aiming basically right at you. Whereas at longer ranges, it's much more forgiving because since it is a cone and it broadcasts outward, at longer ranges, that's a larger area that they're covering with that visible Scope Glint cone. It's also nice to know these exact angles when you are sniping, because it gives you a pretty good indication of whether or not an enemy downrange would be able to see your Scope Glint, depending on whether you're aiming right at them, or maybe you're aiming at a team or a player that's a little bit away from them, and you're worried that a different team is going to end up seeing that Scope Glint from you. Now, the next big question that a ton of people have is, how far away does this Scope Glint appear? And I tested this within Warzone. Honestly, I thought the range on this would be like 500 meters or so, and anything beyond 500 meters, you wouldn't be able to see Scope Glint. However, based on my testing, this seems to be basically infinite. You can see here, I got up to about 800 meters away from the target, and I could still very clearly see that Scope Glint, as long as the target was aiming pretty close to me. So yeah, that's definitely something to be aware of. The range of that Scope Glint is surprisingly far. It's essentially infinite. It might even be completely infinite. I would have a hard time finding a line of sight longer than 800 meters on this map though. But this does just go to show that it is insane how far away this Scope Glint will reach. So those are the main things I wanted to cover in today's video, but there are a couple other little things I wanted to mention. A lot of people have also asked, does Scope Glint show through windows, for instance? So if I'm inside a building and I'm aiming out with my sniper rifle toward an enemy player, can they see the Scope Glint through the glass? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. They will definitely see that scope glint, no problem, even though that doesn't really make any sense, especially if you're backed off in the room and you're completely out of sunlight. It's not about realism, it's about gameplay balance. And yes, the enemies can see scope glint through glass. That goes both ways. Whether you're inside looking out or outside looking in, you can see scope glint in both scenarios. And finally, I've had some people ask, is there any way to counter the scope glint or like make it so your scope glint is reduced or removed? And at least currently, no, aside from switching your optics to something that doesn't have scope glint. So there's no perks or weapon attachments or anything like that that will reduce or remove the amount of scope glint that you are projecting, unless of course you just switch to an optic that doesn't have any scope glint at all. And with that, that wraps it up for today's quick video on the scope glint in Modern Warfare, including Warzone. As for my opinion on this, when it came to regular multiplayer, I really found this mechanic to be like kind of overkill, and I could honestly like take it or leave it, but I am so happy it's there for Warzone. I think the gameplay would devolve very quickly without this scope glint, and it would be nothing but people hiding around and trying to pick people off with sniper rifles more than they already do. Like, that's already a very powerful playstyle that a lot of people are using, and the scope glint at least keeps them in check a little bit when somebody's doing that, and it makes it less scary to move around the map, which I am all for mechanics that do that. And therefore, I am quite happy about this. I also like the fact that you can get rid of that scope glint by just using a lower zoom optic, and there is a trade-off to that. If you are using an extremely high zoom optic, well, the enemy's going to be able to see you if you're aiming down sight in their direction. But of course, that is just my opinion on this. I would like to know in the comment section below, what do you guys think about the scope glint in Modern Warfare, and more specifically within Warzone? Do you like the scope glint? Do you dislike it? Or do you maybe feel like the scope glint is a good thing, but they could have balanced it a little bit better? Just let me know those thoughts in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.